40 years of hard work. What would you trade it all for? For me, I suppose it comes down to something simple. One quiet morning, a cup of coffee the moment I wake, a slice of toast, a glass of milk, one egg over easy. Every man my age understands that no success comes without sacrifice, without loss. And yet there are certain people in this world who believe they can reap a harvest they never planted. That morning, my phone buzzed against the counter. When someone calls a man at 5 in the morning, it usually means they need something. I picked it up. It was my son. And oh, he was laughing, bright and warm as a summer sun. Hey, Dad. So I sold the Anna Marie last month. I know, I forgot to tell you. But do not worry about it, all right? It is all handled. Don't worry, forgot. A man does not simply forget to mention that he sold his own father's boat. Whatever the reason was, it was thin as the morning fog rolling off the water. I stood there in the center of my kitchen, holding the phone against my ear, and I said nothing at all. I let the silence stretch for a full 5 seconds. In the background, behind my son's easy breathing, I could hear the low murmur of an airport terminal, a boarding announcement, the rolling of luggage wheels across polished tile. My son was not calling me from his home. He was calling me from a departure gate, running. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an explanation. I did not ask him why he had suddenly decided to erase me from his life. I simply said, "All right, son. Good luck to you." And then I hung up. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand exactly what my son had just done. My name is Thomas Hale. I am 68 years old, and for the better part of half a century, I have made my living from the cold, gray waters off the coast of Maine. I started with one battered lobster boat and a mountain of debt. I ended with a commercial fishing fleet, a seafood processing empire, and a company worth tens of millions of dollars. I built all of it from nothing but salt stubbornness and a mind that never stopped calculating. Before I ever owned a single vessel, I was a marine engineer. I understood navigation radio systems and the invisible machinery that keeps a ship alive in a storm. I spent my whole life learning to read danger before it arrived. I could feel a squall coming from the shift in the wind hours before the sky ever turned. I built my entire fortune on one simple skill. I saw the threat before the threat saw me. And yet the single greatest danger to everything I had ever built had been sitting at my own dinner table, eating the food I paid for, smiling at me across the candlelight for the better part of a year. The Anna Marie was not just a boat. She was the first vessel I ever bought outright, free and clear, the day the bank finally stopped owning a piece of my soul. I named her after my wife, Anna, the woman who stood on the dock in the freezing rain and waited for me to come home for 31 years. The woman who believed in the harbor I was building long before there was anything to believe in. Anna passed away 4 years ago. Cancer took her slowly, and it took the best part of me along with it. After the funeral, the house by the water became far too quiet. The empty chair at the breakfast table became a wound that never quite closed. And into that silence, into that terrible loneliness, my son Nathan and his wife had come walking, with soft voices and warm smiles and open hands. I should have seen it. God help me, a man who could read a storm 3 hours out could not read the two people sleeping under his own roof. Nathan is 38 years old. I taught that boy to tie a bowline knot when he was 6. I taught him to bait a trap, to read the tide charts, to respect the sea and never turn his back on it. I paid for his college. I financed his first apartment, his wedding, the down payment on his house. Everything that boy had, I had handed to him with my own 2 weathered hands. And now he was standing in an airport somewhere far away, casually mentioning that he had sold the Anna Marie, my boat, named for his own mother. I turned away from the window and the gray water beyond it. I walked down the long hallway of my house, past the framed photographs of a life that suddenly felt like it belonged to another man. My footsteps were slow and even. My hands were perfectly steady. But somewhere, deep beneath the calm surface in the cold engine room of my mind, something had already begun to turn over. A quiet, patient machine warming up after a long sleep. I stepped into my study and closed the heavy door behind me. This was my private room, lined floor to ceiling with charts, logbooks, and the accumulated paper of 40 years at sea. I crossed to the far wall, to an old captain's chest, bolted to the floor beneath the window. Inside that chest, I kept the things that mattered. The original ownership documents for every vessel in my fleet, my succession plans, my will, and one particular document I had signed years ago and prayed I would never need. A medical power of attorney, granting my son the authority to speak for me, only if I could no longer speak for myself. I knelt down. I worked the old brass combination the way I had 1,000 times before, feeling the familiar weight of each tumbler falling into place. I lifted the heavy lid, and my hand reached into empty darkness. The chest was bare. Every folder, every deed, every sealed envelope was gone. Someone had emptied it completely, and they had done it without leaving so much as a fingerprint on the dust. I knelt there in the pale morning light, staring into that hollow wooden box. And I understood that my son had not simply sold a boat. He had declared war. I did not move for a long moment. I stayed there on one knee before the empty chest, the way a man kneels at a grave. And as the cold truth settled into my bones, my mind did what it always does under pressure. It stopped feeling, and it started remembering. It carried me back 8 months, to a warm evening in early spring, when everything still seemed whole. They had come for dinner, Nathan and his wife Vanessa. I remember the table set with Anna's good china, the plates she saved for holidays and never got to use often enough. Vanessa was 3 months along by then, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly the whole evening, as if she were cradling the future itself. After the meal, we sat by the fire. Nathan poured the scotch, and Vanessa looked at me with her large, dark eyes shining, and she began to cry. "Thomas," she whispered, "we have something to tell you. We have been talking, Nathan and I, and we want to raise this baby right here, in Rockland, close to you. We want him to grow up knowing his grandfather, learning the water from the man who knows it best. I will admit it to you now. My old heart, which had been so hollow since Anna died, filled up in that moment like a tide coming home. I had spent 4 years rattling around this big empty house, listening to the silence where my wife used to be. And here was my son telling me he wanted to bring a child into that silence. A grandchild. Laughter in these rooms again. But there is a house, Vanessa went on, dabbing her eyes. The old Fenwick place down on the point. It is perfect for us, perfect for the baby, but it needs so much work. A new roof, the foundation, a nursery. The contractors are asking for a fortune, Thomas. And with the baby coming, Nathan cannot take on that kind of debt right now. We would never ask, you know. We would never ask. But she did not finish the sentence. She did not have to. She simply let it hang there in the firelight, and she looked down at her belly, and she let me finish it for her. I remember the exact weight of the pen in my hand as I wrote that check. My own hand did not hesitate for a single second. $2.5 million. An absurd sum for a house on the point, but I had the money sitting idle, and they knew that I had it. I told myself I was not buying a house. I was buying back the sound of a child in these halls. I was giving Anna the grandchild she had dreamed of and never lived to hold. Anna had wanted that more than anything in the world. In her last months, when the pain was bad and the nights were long, she used to talk about it. She would squeeze my hand and say, Promise me the house will be full again someday, Tom. Promise me there will be children on that dock. And I had promised her. God help me, I had promised. So when Vanessa sat on my sofa with tears on her cheeks and my grandchild in her body and spoke of raising him close to me, she was not asking me for money. She was pressing her thumb directly onto the one bruise that had never healed. She was using my dead wife's dream as a lever to pry open my checkbook. And I never felt a thing. I only felt grateful. That is the cruelest part of it, you see. A con man cannot cheat an honest heart unless that heart is already reaching out to give. They did not steal my trust. I handed it to them, gift-wrapped, with tears of joy in my own eyes. I handed over a fortune, believing I was laying the foundation of my family for the next 50 years. I believed I was securing a place for my grandchild in the harbor I had built. And I did it based on one simple, tender lie. That they were putting down roots. That they were staying. Now, 8 months later, my son stood in an airport somewhere across the country, telling me they had already gone. That they had sold my boat and vanished, and forgotten apparently to mention any of it. The Fenwick house on the point was never renovated. I knew that now with a sick and sudden certainty. There was no roof, no foundation, no nursery. There was only the money, and wherever the money had gone, it had gone there without me. I finally rose to my feet. My knees ached and the room tilted slightly, and I steadied myself against the windowsill. Outside, the fog was beginning to lift off the water, revealing the gray shapes of the boats still moored in my harbor. My harbor. For now. I am a man who has spent his life dealing with failure. Not the small failures of a bad day, but the large ones. Engines that die 40 miles offshore. Storms that come up faster than the forecast. Men who fall overboard into water cold enough to stop a heart in 10 minutes. I learned a long time ago that when a system fails catastrophically, you do not sit down and weep. You do not waste your breath on why. You isolate the damage and you assess exactly what has been lost. And then you begin to act. So I made myself stop remembering. I made myself stop grieving the trust I had thrown into that fire 8 months ago. And I turned my full attention back to the empty chest, because there was one thing missing from it that frightened me far more than any deed or any check. The money I could live without. The boat I could mourn. But there had been one document sealed in that chest that granted my son the power to reach into my very life and take hold of it. A single sheet of paper that could turn my own son into my master if the wrong people ever got their hands on it and told the right lie. I reached over and switched on the small brass lamp on my desk. I angled its hard yellow light directly into the mouth of that empty wooden box, and I bent down close and I looked again. Not hoping, confirming. Every folder was gone. Every deed, every plan, and the medical power of attorney was gone with them. I stood there in the lamplight for a long moment, running through the contents of that chest from memory, the way I once ran through a pre-departure checklist before taking a boat out into open water. A man does not survive 40 years at sea by trusting his feelings. He survives by trusting his lists. The deed to the Anna Marie. Gone, though, I supposed that hardly mattered now, since my son had already sold her out from under me. The ownership papers for the rest of the fleet, 4 vessels beyond her, gone. My succession plan, the document naming Danny Reyes as the man who would take the fleet forward if I ever stepped away from it, gone. The notarized copy of that $2.5 million check, my only proof of exactly how much I had given them and why, gone. And the medical power of attorney, granting Nathan the authority to act for me only if I was ever rendered unable to act for myself. Gone along with everything else. To open that chest, A person needed two things: the exact combination, which I had never once written down on paper, and the small brass key to the inner drawer, which I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out compass casing on my desk. A place I believed no living soul knew existed. And then standing there in the gray morning light, I remembered an afternoon a few weeks back. Vanessa had come to the house unannounced, insisting she wanted to help me clean the study because the dust was bothering her allergies. She had been so gentle about it, so thoughtful, fussing over an old man's cluttered bookshelves, while I took a long call in the kitchen about a shipment delay. She had been alone in that room for the better part of an hour. I remembered thinking at the time how kind it was of her, how lucky I was to have a daughter coming into this family who cared enough to dust an old widower's forgotten corners. Now I understood. She had not been dusting. She had been memorizing. She must have watched me work that combination once, years ago, at some family gathering, when I had no reason to hide it from my own son's wife. She must have found that hollow compass and pressed the little brass key into a bar of soap or a lump of clay, patient as a woman waiting out a long pregnancy, waiting for the exact right moment to come back and empty me out completely. My hands had begun to tremble just slightly, and I hated them for it. I closed them into fists and made them stop. It was at that exact moment that my cell phone buzzed violently in my jacket pocket. The sudden mechanical noise cutting through the silence of the study like a foghorn in a quiet harbor. I nearly dropped the thing. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a security alert from First Coastal Trust, the bank that had handled every dollar I had ever earned since the day I bought my first boat. I read it once, and then I made myself read it again, slowly, to be certain I was understanding it correctly. Security alert. Your primary mailing address and account contact information have been successfully updated to an address in Seattle, Washington. If you did not authorize this change, please contact our fraud department immediately. Seattle, not Rockland. Not even somewhere close enough to explain as a misunderstanding. An address on the opposite side of an entire continent, and it had been entered into my own bank's records as though it belonged there. As though I myself had asked for it. I stood in my study and understood all at once the full shape of what had happened to me. This was not a son forgetting to mention a boat sale. This was not a careless oversight born of a busy young life. Someone had planned this with the same patience I once used to read a coming storm, watching it build for days before it ever broke. They had not simply taken money from me. They had not simply taken a boat that carried my late wife's name. They were, at this very moment, in the process of quietly stealing my entire identity, moving my accounts, my mail, my financial life, 3,000 miles away to a city where I had never once set foot. I thought of the old fishermen I used to sail alongside, men who talked about the sea the way preachers talk about scripture. They used to say, "The ocean never attacks you directly. It finds the one seam in your hull you forgot to check, and it works that seam, patiently, quietly, until the whole boat goes down, before you even feel the water rising around your boots." My son and his wife had found my seam. It was grief. It was loneliness. It was a promise I made to a dying woman about the sound of children in an empty house. I made myself think it through calmly, the way I would work through any failure at sea. Stealing a boat is theft. Stealing money is theft. But changing a man's mailing address, rerouting his bank statements, moving his entire financial identity to a city he has never visited, that is something else entirely. That is not a son taking what does not belong to him. That is a son laying the groundwork to become me, to answer for me, to sign for me. And a man only needs to do that if he is planning, somewhere down the road, to convince the world that I can no longer sign for myself. I thought again of that hollow feeling in my chest when I first heard his voice at the airport. So light, so unbothered. A man does not sound like that while committing a small mistake. He sounds like that when a much larger plan is already moving, and the boat sale was simply the first piece he was careless enough to let slip. I set the phone down on my desk very carefully, the way a man sets down something he is afraid he might otherwise throw across the room. I looked at the empty chest one final time, then closed the heavy lid, and the sound of it closing echoed through the study like a verdict being read. Whatever quiet, patient thing had been stirring in me since that phone call at 5 in the morning, it was fully awake now, and it was no longer afraid. My mind is a strange machine sometimes. Give it one clear threat, and it will hunt down every piece of evidence connected to that threat going back months without me ever consciously asking it to. Standing there in my study, with the bank alert still glowing on my phone, I felt it begin to search. And it landed almost immediately on a patch of ice on my own back steps this past January. I remember the exact sound my hip made when it hit the frozen wood. A dull, wet crack that I felt more than heard. I lay there for a moment, staring up at a gray winter sky, genuinely uncertain whether I would be able to stand again on my own. I did stand eventually. A bruise the size of a dinner plate and a wounded pride were the only lasting damage, or so I believed at the time. But Nathan and Vanessa treated that fall as though I had been carried off the ice on a stretcher. Vanessa practically moved into the guest suite that same week. Nathan was simply too busy at his logistics job in Portland, she explained gently, to come look after his own father properly, and someone needed to be here. She took over my kitchen. She took over my calendar, my doctor's appointments, the small daily rituals of an old man's life. And I let her. God forgive me. I was so grateful not to be alone in that big, empty house that I handed her the keys to my life without a second thought. I remember the exact tone of her voice on the third or fourth evening, sweet and syrupy, sliding a small ceramic dish across my kitchen counter. "Thomas," she said, "you really do need to start taking better care of yourself. These are memory supplements. My holistic nutritionist swears by them. Completely. They support cognitive health, reduce stress, help a man your age think clearly." Inside that little dish sat 3 large, chalky white pills. Why on earth would a father question the woman carrying his future grandchild? I swallowed those pills without a moment's hesitation, night after night, for the better part of 2 months. And in those 2 months, I began to fall apart in ways I had never experienced in 68 years of hard living. I am a man who once navigated a boat through open water, using nothing but a compass, a watch, and the position of the stars, doing the mathematics in my head while soaked to the bone in a gale. And suddenly, I was standing in my own kitchen, unable to remember why I had walked into the room. I misplaced my truck keys for hours at a time, searching the same 3 drawers over and over with a rising, humiliating panic. My speech would slur in the evenings, my tongue thick and slow, refusing to obey the simplest commands from my own brain. I felt like a passenger, locked inside a ship that was slowly, deliberately taking on water, and I could not find the leak. I remember one night in particular, sitting at the dinner table, trying to tell Nathan about a shipment delay at the processing plant, and hearing my own words come out scrambled, half of them missing entirely. Nathan had looked at me with an expression I mistook at the time for concern. "Take it easy, Dad," he said, reaching over to pat my hand. "Nobody expects you to keep up with all that anymore. You worked hard enough for one lifetime. Just rest." And I remember feeling beneath the fog a small flicker of shame at my own decline, never once suspecting that the decline itself had been poured into my glass at his own table. Vanessa was always nearby during those episodes, always hovering at the edge of the room, with her phone raised the little camera light blinking. "Oh, Thomas," she would laugh, softly tapping the glass screen. "You are just so funny when you get tired like this. I am just recording it for Nathan. He worries about you so much, you know, and this will make him smile." It did not feel like a joke shared between family. It felt, even then, like something being cataloged. But I could not explain why, and a mind as foggy as mine had become is a poor witness to its own suspicions. Looking back now, I can see the whole architecture of it, clean and precise as a ship's blueprint. Vanessa did not simply take over my kitchen. She took over my calendar as well, gently steering which doctor I saw and when, always finding some reason why my longtime physician in town was too busy, why a new clinic she had heard wonderful things about might suit me better. She took over my medications, laying them out each evening in a little plastic tray, like a nurse tending a patient. She took over the small daily proof of who I was, one dose at a time, until the man reflected back in her camera lens looked nothing at all like the one who had built an empire out of cold water and stubborn will. Standing in my study now months later, with a clear head and a cold, furious clarity I had not felt in a very long time, I understood exactly what those recordings had been. They were not sweet keepsakes for a worried son. They were evidence. Careful, patient, methodical evidence of an old man losing his mind, built one humiliating video at a time. I thought of court proceedings I had witnessed over the years, involving other families, other estates. I knew, in the way that any successful businessman eventually knows the shape of the law, exactly what kind of case those videos would support. Not a case for love, a case for control. The fog that had clouded my thinking for 2 straight months lifted all at once, the way a real fog burns away the instant the sun finally breaks over open water. I understood now why the pills had stopped the very week Nathan and Vanessa packed their things and vanished toward the airport. They no longer needed me confused. They needed me from this point forward to simply disappear from the conversation entirely. I stood very still in the center of my study, my hands finally steady again, and I felt something harden inside my chest that had nothing to do with 68 years of salt air and hard labor. They had not been caring for me. They had been building a file on me. A file needs evidence to burn it. I had spent 40 years building an empire on cold, hard proof. Contracts, manifests, ledgers that balanced to the penny. I was not about to let my own son destroy me on the strength of a theory alone. If Vanessa had truly been feeding me something beyond memory supplements, there would be proof of it somewhere. And proof, in my experience, has a way of ending up in the trash. They had left in a hurry. That much was obvious the moment I walked out to the garage, still in my robe, the cold morning air biting through the thin fabric. Several large black garbage bags sat piled near the door leading out to the driveway, hastily knotted, abandoned in the rush toward the airport. Wealthy people planning a careful, honest move do not leave their trash behind, like fugitives fleeing a crime scene. They plan, they arrange, they do not simply run. I did not care about the mess. I knelt down on the cold concrete floor and tore the first bag open with my bare hands, ignoring the sharp smell of spoiled food and old coffee grounds. My fingers pushed through discarded takeout containers, crumpled receipts, the mundane debris of 2 people packing up a life and leaving it behind. Nothing. I moved to the second bag, and then the third, my knuckles scraping against broken glass, my breath fogging in the cold garage air. Near the very bottom of the third bag, wedged between a torn parenting magazine and a shattered coffee mug, I found it, a small crushed cardboard box, and inside it, a foil blister pack. I turned it over in my hands under the weak light of the single bare bulb overhead. There was no bright pharmacy logo on it, no dosage chart, no friendly cartoon assurance of gentle wellness. Just a stark alphanumeric code stamped directly into the foil in flat black ink. The kind of code that belongs to something clinical, not something sold over a counter. There were exactly 3 empty slots pressed out of the foil. 3. The precise number of pills Vanessa had slid across my kitchen counter on her very last evening in this house. I gripped that blister pack so tightly the jagged edge of the foil cut into the pad of my thumb. I did not even notice the sting until later, when I saw the thin line of blood drying against my skin. I sat back on my heels there in the cold garage, surrounded by torn bags and spoiled food, and I felt something I had not felt since the night Anna passed. A kind of grief that has no tears left in it, only a low, steady burn. I walked straight back into the house, through the kitchen, down the hall, and into my study, tracking garage dirt across the hardwood floor, without a single thought for the mess. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I had spent enough decades around cargo manifests and shipping regulations to know exactly where to look for a chemical compound with no consumer branding. I bypassed the ordinary search engines entirely and logged into a restricted maritime and pharmaceutical safety database I had used for years to check what my crews were and were not permitted to keep in a ship's medical kit. I typed in the code from the foil, letter by letter, number by number. The results loaded slowly, the way bad news always seems to take its time arriving. I read the chemical composition first, then the primary clinical applications. This was not a memory supplement. This was not anything a holistic nutritionist would ever recommend. It was a heavily regulated neurosuppressant, the kind of compound used almost exclusively in psychiatric settings to sedate patients who could not otherwise be managed. It required multiple physician signatures to legally obtain in any ordinary circumstance. And it was never under any legitimate protocol prescribed to a healthy 68-year-old man with no history of psychiatric illness. The listed side effects filled half the screen in stark clinical language. Severe short-term memory impairment, slurred speech, motor coordination loss, chronic lethargy. A profile that, taken together, perfectly mimicked the early stages of dementia. I sat in the silence of my study and stared at the clean, clinical description of my own poisoning. I read it 3 times, the way a man reads a diagnosis he cannot quite make himself believe, hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder on the 4th pass. They never do. My daughter-in-law had not been caring for me at my own kitchen counter. She had been quietly, deliberately dismantling my mind 1 dose at a time, while smiling at me across the dinner table. And Nathan, my own son, the boy I taught to read a compass before he could read a book, had sat at that same table and watched her do it. He had smiled back at me while his wife fed me a chemical eraser disguised as concern. He had said nothing. He had done nothing. Whatever guilt might have lived in him once, he had buried it somewhere, deep enough that it no longer showed on his face at dinner. They had not simply wanted my money, or my boat, or my company. They needed me weak. They needed me confused enough that no court in this country would ever believe a word I said in my own defense. They needed me legally silenced long before they ever filed a single piece of paper to make it official. I thought of every storm I had ever ridden out at sea, and how the sailors who survived them were never the ones who panicked at the first swell. They were the ones who went quiet, who studied the water, who waited for the exact right moment to act. I made myself become that man again, sitting there at my desk with a bloodied thumb and a poisoner's blister pack in my hand. I closed the laptop slowly, the anger inside me no longer a hot, reckless thing. It had cooled into something else entirely. Something patient. Something that did not need to shout to be dangerous. I needed to know exactly how far they had already gone, and exactly what they had carried out of this house the night before they ran. A man does not survive 40 years on open water by waiting for the storm to explain itself. He goes looking for the source. The source in this case was a hard drive, buried in a locked closet off my study, connected to 11 small cameras I had installed myself around the house and the boathouse 3 years ago, after a string of break-ins along the harbor road left half my neighbors nervous. I am not a man who trusts a system he did not build with his own 2 hands. And so I had wired every one of those cameras myself, running the cable, setting the angles, testing the night vision until I could make out a moth's wings from 50 feet away in total darkness. I remember standing in the hardware store back then, listening to a young salesman try to sell me some cloud-based package that promised to store everything on a server somewhere in another state. I remember telling him quite plainly that I did not intend to hand a stranger in a data center the only record of my own front door. A man who has spent his life reading the ocean does not trust his safety to something he cannot touch. I built my own system instead, wired straight into my own walls, answerable to no one but me. I turned my chair toward the second monitor on my desk, the one hardwired directly into that closet system, and I typed in my administrator credentials. The screen accepted them, and for one brief moment, I felt something almost like relief. I clicked into the archive directory holding the last 72 hours of footage, and the entire screen froze. A harsh, black command window bloomed suddenly in the center of the display, swallowing the ordinary blue interface whole. Lines of code began cascading down the screen, far too quickly for my eyes to follow. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the cascade stopped, and 2 words hung there in stark white letters against the black. Files corrupted. Wipe initiated. I sat very still and watched those words for a long moment, feeling a strange, almost admiring calm settle over me. There was no panic in me, no scramble to save what could not be saved. Somewhere deep in my chest, a version of myself that had spent 40 years managing other men's disasters simply nodded and got to work. Nathan had planned this with real care. He had either hired someone or purchased something sophisticated enough to reach into my home network after they left and scrub the surveillance drive clean, erasing any trace of whatever they had carried out of this house in the dark. It was, I will admit, a smart move. My son had always been sharp when it came to aggressive business tactics, hostile buyouts, the cold arithmetic of taking something away from someone before they noticed it was gone. He understood how to disappear a paper trail. I had taught him a good deal of that sharpness myself, sitting across the kitchen table, explaining how contracts worked, how leverage worked, never once imagining he would someday point all of it back at me. But Nathan had forgotten one detail about the man whose life he was trying to erase. Long before I ever owned a single boat, long before there was a harbor named after my family, or a company with my name stamped on the letterhead, I was a marine engineer who specialized in shipboard communication and navigation systems. I spent years designing redundant systems for vessels that could not afford to lose critical data in the middle of the open ocean. Storms, saltwater intrusion, electrical failure, sabotage. Every good ship I ever worked on carried a second brain, buried somewhere below deck, quietly recording everything the first brain saw in case the first brain was ever drowned. I did not build a simple home security system in this house. I built it the way I built everything else in my life, with a second system underneath the first one in case the first one ever failed. I reached beneath the thick wooden lip of my desk and found the small recessed switch I had installed there myself, hidden from view unless a man already knew exactly where to look. I flipped it, and the compromised monitor went instantly black, severed from the corrupted local drive entirely. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and lifted out a small weathered hard case, the kind fishermen use to protect delicate electronics from salt water. My hands were steady now, in a way they had not been all morning. Inside it sat a physical token drive I had built years ago and never once needed until this exact morning. I plugged it into a second concealed port built into the underside of the desk, a port that had no visible cable running anywhere a hacker could trace. The screen flickered back to life, bypassing the poisoned local network entirely, and reaching instead toward a separate, air-gapped storage unit I had personally embedded into the concrete foundation of the boathouse during its construction 11 years ago. It recorded on a continuous loop, entirely invisible to the home's wireless network, entirely immune to any remote wiping command sent through the front door of my ordinary system. My son had successfully burned down the decoy. He had no idea the real vault was buried beneath his feet the entire time. There was, I confess, a certain grim satisfaction in that thought. The same quiet satisfaction I used to feel watching a storm break itself against a hull I had reinforced myself, unable to touch what it could not even see. I typed in my secondary passcode and pulled up the master archive. Clean, uncorrupted, high-definition footage began populating the screen, in perfect chronological order, time-stamped down to the second. I scrolled backward, past the ordinary quiet nights of an empty house, the porch light clicking on and off, a raccoon crossing the driveway one evening in March, until I found the file I was looking for. My private study, time-stamped almost exactly 72 hours earlier, at 1 o'clock in the morning. I sat forward in my chair. My hand hovered over the mouse for a moment, and I realized almost with surprise that some small, foolish part of me still hoped I was wrong about all of it. That whatever I was about to see would somehow explain itself into something forgivable. That part of me, I suppose, was still a father before it was ever anything else, no matter what the rest of me had already become. I reached forward and clicked play. The footage opened on my own study, lit only by the pale glow of a single desk lamp left burning in the corner. The timestamp in the bottom corner read 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 nights before that phone call from the airport. I watched the heavy door swing open slowly, and 2 familiar shapes slipped inside, moving with the quiet, practiced ease of people who had rehearsed this in their minds a dozen times before ever setting foot in the room. I remember thinking absurdly how strange it was to watch my own home the way a stranger might watch a crime scene unfold on the evening news. Nathan walked straight to the captain's chest beneath the window. He did not pause. He did not hesitate searching for a combination he was not supposed to know. He simply knelt down, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a small folded slip of paper. He worked the brass dial with total confidence, spun it left, then right, then left again, and the heavy lid lifted open on the very first try. My chest tightened as I watched my own son reach inside and begin removing folder after folder, stacking them neatly on the floor beside him. Vanessa stood a few feet away, holding open a cardboard box, loading each document into it with quick, efficient movements. There was no fear in either of them, no hesitation. Only the calm, businesslike rhythm of 2 people completing a task they had planned for weeks. I reached over and turned up the audio feed, and the sensitive microphones I had installed years ago for entirely different reasons picked up their voices with startling clarity. Nathan paused for a moment, holding the medical power of attorney in both hands, studying it under the lamplight. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. And for one brief moment, I heard something in his voice that almost sounded like his father's son. "Once we file this with a doctor's signature attached, there is no walking it back. We are locking him in for good." Vanessa did not even glance up from the box she was packing. She let out a short, cold laugh that I felt land somewhere just beneath my ribs. "Thomas is a sweet old fossil, Nathan," she said, tossing another folder into the box. "He thinks those pills I have been giving him are for his memory. By the time anyone bothers to check, we will already have guardianship. The accounts, all of it. He will not even understand what happened to him." I sat frozen in my leather chair, the cold blue light of the monitor washing over my face, listening to two people calmly discuss erasing me from my own life, as though I were an old fishing boat they had decided to scrap for parts. Vanessa kept talking, her voice light and almost cheerful, the way a person discusses grocery lists rather than the deliberate destruction of another human being. "We already have the doctor lined up in Seattle," she said. "Dr. Prescott owes some very serious people a great deal of money. He will sign whatever we need him to sign. All we have to do is get Thomas declared incompetent before he has a chance to complain to anyone who might actually listen." Nathan set the medical power of attorney gently into the box on top of the other documents. His hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady. "He does still trust me," Nathan said quietly, almost to himself. Vanessa's expression did not change at all. "That is exactly why this works," she answered. "A trusting old man is so much easier to move than a suspicious one." They finished emptying the chest within a few more minutes. Vanessa sealed the cardboard box with a strip of packing tape, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. Nathan closed the empty chest and pressed the lid down softly, as though he were tucking a child into bed rather than robbing his own father blind. Then they slipped back out through the heavy door, and the study returned to its ordinary, undisturbed silence, exactly as I had found it every morning since. I sat in my study hours later, watching my own son's face, frozen on the screen in that final frame. And I understood fully and completely the true shape of what they intended for me. This was never simply about the boat, or the money, or even the company I had spent 40 years building from nothing. They wanted a court somewhere to look at a medical file, a handful of humiliating home videos, and a signed doctor's letter, and declare that Thomas Hale, a man who had once navigated open water using nothing but the stars, was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. Once that declaration was made, Nathan would legally become me. My voice, my signature, my entire existence in the eyes of the law would belong to him. And I would spend whatever years remained to me sitting in some quiet, sterile facility, staring at a wall, while my son and his wife spent the fortune I had built with my own two hands. I closed the video file slowly. My hand was steady on the mouse, steadier than it had any right to be, given what I had just witnessed. They had not simply betrayed me. They had engineered my disappearance piece by careful piece, and they had done it while sitting at my own table, eating food I had paid for, calling me Dad in a voice dripping with false affection. I thought of every dollar I had ever handed my son without question, every debt I had quietly forgiven, every ordinary act of a father's trust, and I understood now that I had spent years feeding the very hand that was already sharpening the knife. I sat back in my chair and let the full silence of the house settle around me. Somewhere outside my window, the tide was beginning to turn, the gray water sliding slowly back out toward the open ocean, patient and indifferent to whatever was happening on the shore. A man does not survive a life at sea by fighting a battle alone once he understands its true size. I had built my company on good crews and good instruments, never on the illusion that one man could do everything himself. It was time I decided to call in the men I trusted most. I reached for my phone and began scrolling through my contacts until I found a number I had not dialed in nearly 3 years. A name Nathan had never once heard me mention in his entire life. The first call I made was to Samuel Cole, my attorney of nearly 20 years. A careful and precise man who had drafted every contract that had ever carried my name. Samuel answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep, and by the time I finished describing the empty chest, the bank alert, and the footage I had just watched, he was wide awake and entirely silent on the other end of the line. "Thomas," he said finally, his voice low and grave, "this is not a family dispute anymore. This is fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. And if even half of what you are describing is provable, we're looking at federal charges. I need you to send me everything. The footage, the blister pack, the bank alert. Do not delete a single file. I promised him I would send it all within the hour. But Samuel was a man of contracts and courtrooms, careful and methodical by nature. And there was one particular piece of this puzzle that required a different kind of man entirely. A man who did not wait for subpoenas. I scrolled further down my contact list until I found the name I had been searching for. Dale Foster. Dale and I had served together many years ago, long before either of us built the lives we eventually built. He had been an intelligence officer with the Coast Guard, the kind of man who could trace a smuggling vessel back through 6 false flag registrations without ever leaving his desk. We had spent 2 long winters stationed together off the coast of Nova Scotia, tracking vessels that did not want to be tracked. And I had trusted him with my life more than once in those years, long before I ever trusted him with a single dollar. When he left the service, he built a private practice doing exactly the same work for men who could afford absolute discretion. I had used him only once before, years ago, to quietly investigate a supplier I suspected of running counterfeit parts through my supply chain. Nathan had never met him. Nathan did not even know he existed. Dale answered on the first ring, as he always did, no matter the hour. "Thomas Hale," he said, his voice carrying the same flat calm I remembered from 30 years earlier. "It has been a long time. What is wrong?" I told him everything, start to finish, in the same clipped, factual tone I would use to report equipment failure on one of my vessels. Dale listened without interrupting once. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line, and then he spoke. "I am 3 hours from Rockland," he said. "I will be at your door before noon. In the meantime, give me everything you have on your daughter-in-law. Full name, date of birth, any email address you can remember. I want to see what she has been doing on the other end of this, before we ever set foot in the same room together." I gave him what little I knew. Vanessa's full maiden name, the city she said she had grown up in, an old email address I recalled from a wedding invitation years earlier. Dale told me to sit tight, to touch nothing further, and to let him work. He called back 2 hours later, and this time, his voice had lost its usual flat calm entirely. "I am in," he said. Her personal email account was protected by the same password she has apparently used on every account she has ever opened since college. It took me 11 minutes. I asked him what he had found. "Mostly what you would expect," he said. "Shopping receipts, a few messages to a real estate agent in Seattle about a property listing. But there is one folder, buried under a mislabeled name, sitting in her drafts, that I think you need to see for yourself. I am sending it to your email right now." I pulled the message up on my laptop, with my heart beating harder than it had any right to at my age. It was an unsent draft, carefully composed, addressed to a family court judge in King County, Washington. I opened it and began to read. The message described in calm and clinical language a man suffering from rapid and severe cognitive decline. It cited a series of troubling incidents: confusion, memory loss, slurred speech, all of it framed as unmistakable evidence of advancing dementia. It referenced a series of home videos as supporting documentation. It referenced a physician's evaluation already prepared and waiting to be attached from a Dr. Prescott of Seattle. And then my eyes drifted upward to the subject line Vanessa had so carefully typed at the top of that draft. And I felt the blood in my veins turn to ice water. Emergency guardianship petition. Thomas Hale, incapacitated. I sat in the silence of my study, staring at those words on the screen. And I understood finally and completely that this was never simply about money at all. They were not merely stealing from me. They intended to have a judge somewhere in a courtroom I had never set foot in sign a piece of paper declaring that Thomas Hale no longer existed as a man capable of speaking for himself. I thought of every year I had spent teaching Nathan how to read a contract, how to spot the hidden clause buried on page 9 that could cost a man everything. I had taught him well, it seemed. He had simply chosen to use every lesson against the man who taught him. There was a particular kind of grief in that realization, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with watching your own hands turned into a weapon aimed back at your own chest. Dale's voice came back over the line, steady and low. "Thomas," he said, "this draft is not finished yet. It has not been sent. Whatever they are planning, we still have time to move first. But I need you to understand something. Once we start pulling on this thread, there will be no putting it back the way it was. Your son will not simply be embarrassed. He will very likely go to prison." I sat with that for a moment, feeling the old familiar weight of a difficult decision settle onto my shoulders. The same weight I used to feel standing on deck before ordering a crew into rough water. I looked out my study window at the gray water of the harbor, calm and unbothered under the morning light, entirely indifferent to the war that had just been declared inside these walls. "Good," I said quietly. "Then let us make sure it never gets sent at all." Samuel arrived at my house just after 10 that morning, still dressed in the same rumpled shirt he must have thrown on the moment he hung up the phone. He carried a leather satchel stuffed with legal pads, and he set it down on my desk with the careful precision of a man who had spent 30 years handling other people's disasters for a living. I walked him through everything: the empty chest, the bank alert, the blister pack, and finally the footage itself, which he watched twice in complete silence, his jaw tightening a little more with each pass. When it finished the second time, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes for a long moment before speaking. "Thomas," he said, "I need you to understand exactly what we are looking at here, because it is worse than simple theft. This is not a case where your son took some money and ran. This is a coordinated plan to have you declared legally incompetent." I told him I understood that much already from the draft email Dale had found. "You understand the intention," Samuel said, "but I do not think you understand the mechanics yet. And the mechanics are the part that should frighten you." He pulled a legal pad from his satchel and began to sketch out a rough diagram as he spoke, the way he always did when explaining something complicated to a client. "If Nathan files that guardianship petition in Washington state, accompanied by a signed medical evaluation claiming you present an immediate danger to yourself, the court there can move remarkably fast on an emergency basis, faster than most people realize. A judge can issue what is called an emergency medical evaluation order without ever requiring you to appear, without ever requiring your own attorney to be present, based entirely on the sworn statement of a licensed physician and a close family member." I asked him what that meant in practical terms, sitting there in my own study, 3,000 miles from that courtroom. "It means," Samuel said, choosing his words with obvious care, "that Washington state law enforcement could legally request cooperation from Maine authorities to execute that order here, in this house. If the paperwork is clean enough on its surface, and Dr. Prescott's signature carries the weight of an actual license, the local police in Rockland could be legally obligated to escort you out of your own home for an emergency evaluation, whether you protest or not. You would not be arrested, technically. You would simply no longer be considered capable of refusing." I sat very still in my chair, feeling the full, cold weight of what he was describing settle over me, like water rising in the hull of a sinking boat. "And once I am removed from this house," I said quietly, "once I am sitting in some facility somewhere, unable to reach a phone or a lawyer, Nathan holds the medical power of attorney." Samuel nodded slowly. "And with that document in hand, combined with a court finding of incapacity, he would have full legal authority over every account, every property, every share of the company within days. Not years from now, days. By the time any of us could get a hearing scheduled to challenge the order, the practical damage would already be done. Assets moved, accounts drained, board seats reassigned. Courts are very good at eventually correcting a wrong. They are far less good at doing it quickly enough to matter. I asked him, my voice sounding strange and distant, even to my own ears, whether there was any way to stop such an order once it had been signed by a judge. There is, he said, but it requires speed and evidence, both delivered before the order is ever executed. Once state troopers are standing on your porch with a signed medical evaluation order in hand, Thomas, the time for arguing the merits of the case is already over. You do not win that argument on your own front steps. You win it in the days before the paperwork is ever filed, by making sure the fraud underneath it collapses before anyone in a robe ever has to read it. I thought of every storm warning I had ever ignored in my younger years, back before I understood how quickly calm water could turn violent. And I felt something similar happening here. A system that looked stable and orderly on its surface, riddled underneath, with the exact kind of seam a patient, calculating person could pry open if they understood where to look. They are not simply trying to steal from me, I said slowly, working it through out loud the way I would work through a failing engine. They are trying to legally erase me, to make it so that whatever I say from this point forward carries no more legal weight than the ramblings of a confused old man. That is precisely it, Samuel said. And I will tell you something else, Thomas. This is not a plan built by an amateur. Someone understood interstate guardianship law well enough to structure this whole operation around its blind spots. That kind of understanding does not come cheap, and it does not come without professional guidance. I thought immediately of Dr. Prescott, whose name Dale had already flagged as deeply in debt to people who did not forgive debts kindly. A desperate physician willing to sign a false diagnosis was one piece of the puzzle. But Samuel was suggesting something larger, some additional hand guiding the legal architecture of the entire scheme from somewhere out of sight. Someone who understood which levers to pull long before Nathan ever thought to pull them himself. I do not yet know who else is involved, Samuel admitted, closing his legal pad. But I intend to find out, because whoever built this framework built it to survive exactly the kind of counterattack we are about to launch. I looked out my study window one final time at the harbor stretching gray and endless toward the horizon boats I had built my entire life around, rocking gently at their moorings, indifferent to the storm gathering 3,000 miles away, in a courthouse I had never once visited. Then we had better move faster than they expect, I said, because I do not intend to become a footnote in my own son's fortune. Not while I still have breath enough to fight for the name I built with my own 2 hands. Dale was the one who suggested it, sitting at my kitchen table over a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. If Nathan calls to check in, he said, and men like your son always do, if only to make certain the old fool back home has not caused any trouble. You need to give him exactly what he expects to see. Confusion, gratitude, a father who still trusts him completely. Every good operation runs on the enemy believing they already know how the story ends, he added. Let him keep believing it a little while longer. I did not care for the idea of performing weakness for a man who had spent months manufacturing it in me for real. There was something almost unbearable about the thought of handing him one more moment of satisfaction, even a false one. But Dale was right, and I had spent enough years running a company to understand the value of letting an opponent believe the battlefield still favored him. The call came that same afternoon, a video call lighting up my laptop screen with Nathan's name attached to it. I took a slow breath, let my shoulders slump slightly, softened the focus in my eyes, the way I imagined a tired old man's focus might soften, and answered. Nathan's face filled the screen, tanned already from wherever he was staying, his collar open and casual. Behind him, I could see the edge of an unfamiliar kitchen. White marble counters, a window full of a skyline I did not recognize. "Hey, Dad," he said, his voice warm and easy. "How are you holding up? Getting enough rest?" I let my voice waver slightly. "I am a little tired today, Nathan," I said. "I keep forgetting what day it is. Is it Tuesday?" "It is Thursday, Dad," he said, and I heard something flicker behind his eyes that I chose not to examine too closely at the time. Some small satisfaction disguised as concern. "Do not worry about the days. You just focus on resting. I have got everything handled from here." Vanessa leaned into frame beside him, her hand resting on the curve of her belly, her smile wide and warm and utterly false. "We are handling the transition, Thomas," she said sweetly. "Nathan has to run to a little networking thing this evening, some local logistics people. But we will call you again soon. You just relax. Get some rest," Nathan added quickly, adjusting his collar. "Just trying to drum up a little consulting work down here. Keep the lights on while we settle in. We will call tomorrow, okay? Get some rest, Dad." "I will," I murmured, letting my voice trail off, exactly the way I imagined a confused old man's voice might trail off. "Good luck with your networking thing, son." The screen went dark as they ended the call, and I sat there for a moment in the silence of my study, feeling something cold and ugly settle in my stomach. I had just watched my own son perform tenderness for a father he believed he had already broken. And I had performed helplessness right back at him. And neither performance had contained a single true word. I dropped the frail posture the instant the screen went black. My spine straightened, my jaw set. It was less than 3 minutes later that my second phone, the secure line Dale had given me that morning, buzzed once, sharp and short. I picked it up and opened the encrypted message waiting there. Dale had not sent a text. He had sent a single photograph, time-stamped less than 5 minutes earlier. I stared at it for a long moment, my breath slowing to something close to a stop. Nathan was not at a small local networking event. The photograph showed him seated inside the private dining room of an extraordinarily expensive steakhouse, leaning forward in animated conversation, a bottle of wine sweating gently on the white tablecloth between him and the man across from him. I recognized that face immediately, even before Dale's message identified him a moment later. Sten Halvorsen, the founding chief executive of Nordvik Marine, the Norwegian seafood conglomerate that had spent the better part of a decade trying to buy its way into the same southern fishing grounds I had spent 40 years defending. I had personally blocked 3 separate attempts by Halvorsen's company to acquire processing rights along our stretch of the coast, each time at considerable cost and considerable satisfaction. Now my own son was sitting across a dinner table from him, smiling, using money he had stolen from my chest to orchestrate something with the one man in this industry I had fought hardest to keep at arm's length. Dale's message followed a moment later. Confirmed reservation was made under a shell company registered to Lonewick Maritime Holdings. Nathan is listed as founder and controlling officer. Digging into the paperwork now, I set the phone down slowly on my desk, feeling the last small, foolish hope I had been carrying somewhere beneath my anger finally burn away completely. Some quiet part of me, I realized, had still been hoping this was all somehow smaller than it appeared. That my son had simply been foolish or desperate or led astray by a wife with sharper edges than his own. That hope did not survive the sight of him laughing over expensive wine with the one man who had spent a decade trying to take everything from me. This was never simply a son running from his responsibilities toward an easier life somewhere far from home. My son was using the fortune he had stolen from me to build a rival company, and he was doing it in direct partnership with the one man who had spent a decade trying to tear apart everything I had built. He was not merely walking away from my legacy, he was selling it piece by piece to the enemy who wanted it most. I thought of every closed-door negotiation I had ever won against Halverson over the years, every contract I had fought to keep out of his hands. And I felt an old familiar instinct stir back to life somewhere beneath the grief. I had beaten that man before, fair and square, on the open water of legitimate business. I intended to beat him again on considerably less honorable ground. I looked out at the harbor one final time that evening, the boats rocking gently in the dying light, and I understood that the quiet time of patient observation had officially come to an end. Dale called again just after midnight, and this time, there was no flat calm left in his voice at all. "I have been tracing the money," he said, the way a man announces a diagnosis he has been dreading. "Thomas, I think you had better sit down for this one." I told him I was already sitting, and I was in the same worn leather chair I had occupied for most of that endless day. "It started with a $10 million commercial loan," Dale said, "taken out against 3 of your waterfront properties. The Fenwick lot, the old cannery building on Tilson Avenue, and the second dock you own outright near the breakwater. The loan documents carry your signature, or something built to pass for it, along with a notarized copy of a medical power of attorney authorizing Nathan to execute the transaction on your behalf." I felt my stomach turn over slowly, the way it does on a boat riding the wrong side of a swell. "The same document," I said. "The one they stole from my chest." "The very same," Dale confirmed. "They forged the notarization, most likely using contacts Dr. Prescott arranged for them in Seattle. The bank processed it without asking too many questions, because on paper, everything looked entirely legitimate. $10 million wired out within 72 hours, landing in an operational account belonging to Lonewick Maritime Holdings." I asked him what precisely a company with a name like that intended to do with $10 million of stolen money. Dale was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that told me he had been sitting with this answer for a while before deciding how to deliver it to me. "They are not building a competitor from scratch, Thomas," he said finally. "That would take years, and Nathan does not have years. What he has instead is a signed letter of intent buried in the corporate filings I pulled this evening to execute a leveraged buyout of Coldwater Processing and Storage. I understand that name means something to you." It meant everything to me. Coldwater Processing was not simply another company along the coast. It was the single cold storage and distribution facility that every serious fishing operation south of Bar Harbor depended on to keep their catch from spoiling before it reached market, mine included. I had spent 15 years negotiating fair, long-term contracts with the family that owned it, keeping prices reasonable for every small operator up and down this stretch of coastline, myself included. Whoever controlled Coldwater Processing controlled the artery every fleet in this region needed to survive. I remembered standing in that very facility as a much younger man, shaking hands with old Elias Coldwater himself over a contract that had nothing written into it beyond good faith. And I remembered promising him, in a way that felt like more than a business arrangement, that I would never let anyone turn his family's life work into a weapon against the very fishermen it was built to serve. Halverson has wanted that facility for a decade. Dale continued. Nordvik Marine has made 3 separate offers over the years, all of them rejected, largely because you personally vouched for the family that owns it and convinced them not to sell to a foreign conglomerate looking to consolidate the entire regional supply chain under one roof. Nathan is using your own stolen money to finance the exact acquisition you spent a decade preventing. Once the deal closes, Halverson gains majority control. Your fleet, along with every other independent boat in this harbor, would be entirely at the mercy of pricing set by the same man you spent your career keeping at arm's length. I sat in silence for a long moment, feeling the full architecture of my son's betrayal finally reveal itself in its complete and terrible shape. This was never merely about punishing me, or even simply enriching himself at my expense. Nathan was using my own money, stolen through my own forged signature, to hand my greatest rival the single most valuable piece of leverage in this entire industry. He was not just walking away from the empire I built. He was arming the man most capable of destroying what remained of it, and profiting handsomely from the transaction on his way out the door. I thought of every fisherman I had ever helped keep afloat through a bad season. Every small operator who trusted Coldwater's fair pricing because I had personally guaranteed it would remain fair. If Halverson gained control, all of that would collapse within a single season, and every man who had ever trusted my word would pay the price for a betrayal that had nothing to do with them at all. Men like young Danny Reyes, who ran 2 of my smaller vessels, and had a wife and a new baby, depending on a fair price at the dock every single week. Nathan was not simply gambling with my fortune. He was gambling with the livelihoods of every family up and down this coast who had ever trusted the name Hale meant something honest. "When does the deal close?" I asked, my voice quieter and steadier than I expected it to be. 48 hours, Dale said. "There is a signing scheduled at a private event Nathan is hosting in Seattle. Some kind of celebration dinner, from what I can tell. Halverson will be there in person to finalize the transaction." 48 hours. The same window Samuel had warned me about that morning when he described how quickly a fraudulent guardianship order could move through the Washington courts once it was finally filed. 2 separate weapons aimed at the same target, both scheduled to fire within the same narrow stretch of time. I looked out my study window at the dark water beyond it, the harbor lights reflecting in broken fragments across the black surface, and I felt the last soft edges of grief inside me finally harden into something I recognized from a lifetime spent surviving storms far more literal than this one. "We are not simply going to stop this deal," I said quietly, more to myself than to Dale. "We are going to let it happen exactly as they have planned it, right up until the very last possible second." Dale was silent on the line for a moment. And then, for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun, I heard something that almost sounded like respect in his voice. "Understood," he said. "Then we had better start packing." I did not sleep that night. Not that I expected to. I sat at my desk making calls, reviewing documents Dale continued to send in a steady stream, and watching the clock on my wall tick forward with a patience I no longer possessed. Samuel arrived again just before dawn, this time with a second attorney in tow, a sharp young woman named Priya Anand, who specialized in exactly the kind of interstate guardianship disputes I now found myself facing. It was Priya who took the call that finally confirmed our worst fears, just after 7 in the morning. She listened for less than a minute before her face went pale, and she held up one hand for silence before I had even finished asking what was wrong. I watched her expression change in real time, the professional composure cracking just slightly at the edges, and I understood before she ever spoke a word that whatever news she carried was not going to be good. "The petition was filed an hour ago," she said, lowering the phone slightly. "King County Family Court. Emergency guardianship, supported by a signed medical evaluation from a Dr. Prescott. The judge reviewed it this morning and issued a preliminary order, authorizing an emergency welfare check with medical evaluation to be conducted at your residence." I asked her as calmly as I could manage what that meant in terms of time. "The order authorizes Maine State Troopers to conduct the welfare check within 48 hours, she said. "If they determine on site that you present a danger to yourself consistent with the medical evaluation on file, they are authorized to transport you to a designated facility for a full psychiatric hold pending a formal competency hearing." 48 hours. The exact same window Dale had given me for the Coldwater processing signing in Seattle. 2 blades falling from opposite directions, both scheduled to land within the same narrow stretch of time, as though my son had built his entire plan around the assumption that I would be too paralyzed by one threat to properly address the other. Samuel was already moving before Priya finished speaking, pulling his laptop from his satchel and typing with the fast, controlled urgency of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of crisis. "I need everything we have gathered so far," he said, not looking up from the screen. "The footage, the blister pack analysis, the forged loan documents, the intercepted email. I am filing an emergency motion this morning to stay the welfare check, on the grounds that the underlying medical evaluation was fraudulently obtained through documented poisoning and forged legal instruments. It will not stop the order permanently, but it may buy us critical hours, while a judge here in Maine reviews the evidence properly." I asked him honestly whether he believed it would work in time. Samuel looked up at me then, and for the first time in 20 years of knowing him, I saw genuine fear behind his composed, professional exterior. "I believe it gives us a fighting chance, Thomas," he said. "But I will not lie to you. This is close. Closer than I would like." I made my decision in that moment, standing in the center of my own study, the same room where I had discovered the empty chest that started all of this. I thought of Anna, and what she would have said watching me stand here, weighing the decision. And I knew with a certainty that surprised me exactly what her answer would have been. She had never once, in 31 years of marriage, watched me sit still while a storm approached. "I am not staying here to wait and see whether a piece of paper arrives in time," I said. "I am flying to Seattle." Samuel started to object something about the risk of leaving Maine while an active order hung over my head. But I raised my hand and stopped him mid-sentence, the same way I once stopped younger men from arguing with a decision already made on the deck of my own boat. "Nathan believes I am sitting here, sedated and helpless, waiting for the authorities to come collect what remains of me," I said. "He believes the greatest danger in his life right now is a signature on a piece of paper filed 3,000 miles away. He has absolutely no idea that I am about to be standing in the same city where he plans to sign away my life's work." Dale had already arranged everything by the time I finished speaking, as though he had known this decision was coming before I made it myself. A private charter was waiting at the small regional airfield outside Rockland, filed under a tail number registered to a shell corporation with no visible connection to Hale Fisheries or my own name. We would be off the radar, entirely invisible to anyone tracking commercial flights or standard private aviation logs. I packed a single bag. I did not bring much. A change of clothes, my most essential documents, and the small weathered hard case containing the physical backup drive that had saved my surveillance footage from Nathan's attempted wipe. Everything else, I decided I would either win back in Seattle or lose entirely. And either outcome no longer frightened me the way it might have a week earlier. The drive to the airfield passed in near total silence, the gray Maine coastline sliding past the window in the pale early light. Dale sat beside me, quiet and watchful, occasionally glancing at his phone as updates continued arriving from every direction at once. We boarded the small jet just as the sun cleared the horizon completely, painting the water below in long streaks of gold and steel gray. The engines roared to life, and within minutes we were climbing steadily westward, leaving behind the harbor I had spent 40 years building, chasing after the son who believed he had already won. I sat back in the narrow leather seat and closed my eyes for the first time in nearly 24 hours, though sleep never fully came. Somewhere below us, state troopers were preparing paperwork to knock on the door of an empty house. Somewhere ahead of us, my son was preparing champagne and handshakes for a celebration he believed was already secured. He had no idea I was flying 500 miles an hour directly toward him, carrying with me everything I would need to make certain he never touched another dollar of what he had stolen. We touched down at a small private terminal in the outskirts of Seattle, just before dawn. The air outside, thick and damp in a way that felt utterly foreign after a lifetime of sharp, Maine salt air. I stood on the tarmac for a brief moment, feeling the strange, disorienting weight of standing on unfamiliar ground while carrying the full weight of my old life on my shoulders. A dark sedan was waiting nearby, arranged through contacts Dale trusted from his years in this line of work. And we climbed into the back seat as the first gray light began creeping over the distant mountains. Dale pulled up a set of coordinates on his phone as we merged onto the highway. The address belonged to a gated community on the eastern edge of the city, an exclusive neighborhood where Nathan and Vanessa had apparently purchased a house large enough to host whatever celebration they were planning for the following evening. I told the driver to bypass that neighborhood entirely. Dale glanced over at me, his expression unreadable in the dim morning light. "I would have thought that was our first stop," he said. "Nathan and Vanessa are simply the visible symptoms of this infection," I told him. "If we go rushing at them first, we give the actual disease time to keep spreading, somewhere out of sight. I want to go straight to the source. The man who signed his name to a lie and gave it the weight of a medical license." I had assumed up until that point that my son had simply found some desperate physician willing to accept a cash bribe in exchange for a falsified diagnosis. A single dishonest transaction, ugly but simple. But the speed and legal precision of that guardianship filing suggested something far more calculated. A level of professional cooperation that troubled me more than I wanted to admit. We arrived at a sprawling medical complex in the heart of the city's most prestigious healthcare district. A building composed almost entirely of reflective blue glass, radiating the particular kind of quiet wealth that only comes from treating patients who never once have to consider the cost of their own care. Dale directed the driver into a shaded corner of the parking lot, tucked behind a row of tall evergreens, well out of view of the main entrance. He did not reach for the door handle. Instead, he opened a small tactical case resting on the seat beside him and withdrew a compact piece of equipment I did not immediately recognize. A directional antenna, no larger than a paperback book. "This clinic almost certainly runs its own private wireless network for administrative staff," Dale explained, angling the device toward the upper floors of the building. "If I can get close enough, I can create an identical shadow network right here in this car. Sooner or later, someone inside makes the mistake of connecting their phone to what looks like the familiar office network. And once they do, I am inside their entire system." I asked him how long that typically took. "Faster than you would like to believe," he said. "People trust familiar names far more than they should." It took, in the end, just under 6 minutes. Dale's screen filled with rapidly scrolling text as he worked his way past the clinic's administrative firewalls. Bypassing patient privacy protections meant to keep exactly this kind of intrusion from ever happening. I watched in silence, understanding perhaps 1 word in 5 of what scrolled past, until Dale finally slowed his search and turned the laptop slightly so I could see the screen clearly. "Here," he said quietly. "Dr. Aaron Prescott, board certified, currently facing 3 separate malpractice complaints buried in internal review, none of them public yet. But look at this." He pulled up a second file. This one containing what appeared to be internal financial correspondence between the clinic's billing department and an outside collections agency. Prescott owed a staggering amount of money. Dale explained the kind of debt that does not come from ordinary medical school loans or a mortgage gone sideways. Private, high-stakes gambling debts accumulated over several years. The sort of obligation owed to people who did not send polite reminder letters when payments came due. And there Dale continued scrolling. Further, a wire transfer landed in Prescott's personal account 11 days ago. $150,000, originating from an account registered to Lone Wick Maritime Holdings. I sat in silence in the back of that car, staring at the clean, damning evidence laid out across Dale's screen. My son had not simply found a desperate doctor willing to bend the truth for a modest fee. He had specifically located a man drowning in debt, Dangerous enough to make him willing to risk his entire medical license and freedom for the right price. And he had paid that price without hesitation. There was something almost clinical in the precision of it, a coldness that felt foreign to the boy I remembered teaching to tie knots on the back deck of my first boat. Patient and gentle with his small, clumsy fingers. "This is not the work of an amateur," I said quietly, echoing Samuel's words from the day before. Dale nodded slowly. Whoever advised Nathan on this arrangement knew exactly what kind of physician to look for and exactly how much leverage that debt would provide. This was built by someone who understands both medicine and desperation extremely well. I thought of Vanessa's cold, business-like tone on that surveillance footage, discussing my supposed decline the way another person might discuss quarterly earnings. And I felt a fresh wave of certainty settle over me, regarding exactly whose mind had architected this entire operation from the very beginning. It did not matter now. We spent that final day in careful, quiet preparation, moving pieces into position, the way a good captain readies a vessel before sailing directly into a storm he has chosen to meet rather than avoid. Samuel remained in Maine, working every legal channel available to delay the welfare check order, while simultaneously preparing federal filings we would need the moment our evidence became public. Priya coordinated with a contact at the Securities and Exchange Commission, laying groundwork we would need the instant Nathan's scheme collapsed. Dale, meanwhile, secured a plain gray surveillance van parked a discreet distance from the address where Nathan and Vanessa had chosen to host their celebration. The house itself sat on a hillside overlooking Lake Washington, an enormous modern structure of glass and steel that could not have looked more different from the modest salt box home where I had raised my son. I remembered sitting there in the van, the small, drafty house on the harbor road where Nathan had grown up, the leaky roof I patched myself every autumn, and I found myself wondering what exactly he believed he had been missing all those years. Cars lined the long driveway by early evening, expensive and gleaming, and through the tall windows I could see the warm golden light of a party already gathering momentum inside. I sat in the back of the van beside Dale, watching a bank of small monitors fed by a directional microphone he had aimed carefully at the largest window facing the lake. The device could isolate a single pane of glass and read the faint vibrations of conversation happening on the other side of it, translating those vibrations back into clear, audible sound. It was, Dale assured me, entirely legal in a public setting such as this, provided we never crossed onto their private property. Vanessa moved through the party, like a woman entirely convinced her new life had already been secured. She wore an elegant dress that did little to hide her advancing pregnancy, and she stood near the base of a sweeping staircase, glass of sparkling cider in hand, entertaining a small cluster of what appeared to be new social acquaintances. Chicago was becoming far too complicated, I heard her say through the speaker, her voice carrying easily across the quiet evening air. And Thomas, well, Nathan's father, took a very sudden turn for the worse health-wise. We had to step in and take over completely. It has been incredibly difficult, but Nathan has been so remarkably strong through all of it. I sat perfectly still in that dark van, listening to my daughter-in-law construct in real time the exact public narrative that would later support their courtroom performance. The tragic failing old father, the heroic devoted son forced to step into an impossible situation. It was a flawless piece of theater, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed every line a dozen times before an audience of strangers who had no reason to doubt a single word. But the true business of the evening had nothing to do with the socialites gathered near that staircase. Dale tapped my shoulder and pointed toward a second monitor. A long black car had just pulled into the circular driveway, and a tall, silver-haired man stepped out, flanked by two serious-looking men in dark suits carrying leather briefcases. Sten Halverson, Dale confirmed quietly. I watched Nathan practically sprint from the front door to greet him, pumping his hand with an eagerness that bordered on desperate, the enthusiasm of a much smaller man trying very hard to appear larger than he actually was. I felt something twist painfully in my chest, watching my own son grovel before the man he was about to hand my life's work to on a silver platter. He looked, in that moment, exactly like a boy trying desperately to impress an older captain whose respect he would never actually earn, no matter how eagerly he shook the man's hand. They spoke briefly near the entrance. Then Nathan led Halverson away from the crowded main room toward a quieter, formal dining space at the rear of the house. Heavy wooden doors closed behind them, sealing the two men away from the party entirely. Dale immediately redirected the laser microphone toward the single pane of glass overlooking that private dining room, and their conversation snapped into sharp, clear focus through our speakers. "Thank you for making the trip on such short notice," Sten Nathan said, his voice carrying an edge of manufactured confidence that did not fully mask the nervous energy underneath it. Halverson let out a low, measured laugh. "I admit, Nathan, when you first reached out about executing a leveraged buyout of cold water processing, I was skeptical. Your father blocked every attempt Nordvik ever made toward that facility. I assumed you were operating under his direction." "My father is no longer steering anything," Nathan replied, his tone turning noticeably colder. "He has suffered a serious cognitive decline. I hold his medical power of attorney, and I am liquidating his commercial holdings to fund something considerably more forward-thinking. Lonewick is the future. We are cutting away the dead weight holding this entire region back." I sat in the darkness of that van, listening to my only son casually describe my total erasure to the very man he was selling my legacy to. And I felt the last lingering trace of paternal hesitation finally burn away completely. "I see," Halverson murmured. And I heard the distinct sound of a heavy leather folder being placed onto the table between them. "I have reviewed the financial disclosures your lending institution provided. The $10 million is fully verified and sitting in escrow. Assuming the capital clears by tomorrow morning, the facility, its infrastructure, and its regional contracts belong entirely to you." Dale glanced over at me in the dim light of the van, his finger hovering above his keyboard, waiting silently for the word that would tell him whether to freeze that escrow account immediately or let the evening continue exactly as planned. I shook my head slowly. "Let it happen," I said quietly. "I do not simply want to stop them. I want the entire world to see exactly what they were willing to do." A moment later, I heard the sharp, celebratory pop of a champagne cork through the speaker, followed by the clink of crystal glasses meeting in a toast neither man had any idea would be their last. Somewhere behind that closed door, my son was raising a glass to a victory that no longer existed. I heard the rustle of heavy paper through the speaker, followed by the sharp, deliberate scratch of a fountain pen moving across a signature line. Nathan was signing his name to the acquisition agreement, binding himself formally to a fraudulent transaction built entirely on a forged medical power of attorney and a stolen fortune. The scratching stopped. "Excellent," Halverson said, his voice shifting into brisk, satisfied efficiency. "The contracts are now fully executed. I simply need final authorization from your lending institution to release the $10 million from escrow." I heard Nathan pull his laptop closer across the table, his fingers already moving across the keys. "Consider it done, Sten," he said, his voice practically vibrating with a triumph that had nothing beneath it but stolen ground. "I am authorizing the release right now. The funds are moving as we speak." I sat in the darkness of that van and listened to my son's arrogance hang in the humid evening air. And I felt something inside me settle into perfect, patient stillness. What Nathan did not know, what he could not possibly have known, was that Samuel and Priya had spent the entire previous night working a different angle entirely. One I had specifically asked them not to mention to Dale or myself until every piece was locked firmly into place. Using the documented evidence of the forged notarization, the traced bribe to Dr. Prescott. and sworn statements built from the surveillance footage Samuel had petitioned the escrow bank directly that morning, requesting an emergency fraud hold on any transaction originating from the account tied to that $10 million loan. Simultaneously, Priya had filed preliminary notice with both the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission, formally alerting them to a pattern of interstate wire fraud and forged legal instruments connected to Lonewick Maritime Holdings. I had insisted on keeping this part of the plan quiet, even from Dale, for one simple reason. A man cannot betray a secret he does not know he is holding. And I needed Nathan to walk into that room, believing every door remained wide open in front of him. The best traps I had learned many years ago running crews through waters that did not forgive mistakes are the ones the prey never sees until the jaws are already closing. The bank, once presented with documented proof of forgery, does not ask permission before freezing an account. It simply freezes it. I watched through the monitor as Nathan leaned forward, squinting at his laptop screen, his easy confidence visibly faltering for the first time all evening. He tapped at the keyboard again, harder this time, attempting to refresh whatever banking portal he had been watching. "Is there a problem with the transfer, Halverson?" asked, his warm, celebratory tone draining away, almost instantly replaced by something considerably colder. No issue at all," Nathan stammered. And even through the imperfect quality of the audio feed, I could hear the thin, nervous edge creeping into his voice. "It is likely just a routing delay, a standard security precaution for a transfer of this size. I will have my bankers push it through manually first thing in the morning." Halverson's response came flat and merciless. "Tomorrow morning was not our agreement, Nathan. You assured me this capital was fully cleared and ready to move tonight. I do not sign acquisition contracts on the promise of a delay." I heard Nathan's fingers moving frantically across his keyboard, attempting to access secondary accounts, growing more desperate with every passing second. But the fraud hold Samuel had arranged did not simply freeze the single transaction. It flagged every account connected to the forged power of attorney, entirely severing Nathan's access to the full $10 million in a single, silent motion. Every backup plan he might have imagined, every secondary account he might have hoped to reach, had already been sealed shut hours before he ever sat down at that table. I sat forward in my seat, watching the scene unfold through Dale's monitor, with a strange, quiet calm settling over me. The same calm I used to feel watching a storm finally break itself apart against a hull I had built to withstand it. While Nathan struggled desperately to salvage his collapsing transaction in that private dining room, an entirely separate crisis was unfolding out in the crowded foyer, one neither of them had any idea was already in motion. Dale shifted the microphone toward the front entrance, where Vanessa still stood near the staircase, laughing with her circle of new acquaintances, entirely unaware of the disaster quietly consuming her husband a few rooms away. She had spent the entire evening performing the role of a woman whose life had finally arrived exactly where she believed it belonged. And I found a certain grim satisfaction in knowing that performance was about to end far sooner than she expected. A man in a crisp black caterer's uniform approached her, his expression pale and visibly uncomfortable. He leaned in close, lowering his voice, though the sensitive microphone caught every word with perfect clarity. "Mrs. Hale, I do apologize for the interruption," he said quietly. "We attempted to process the final payment for this evening's catering service, and the card was declined. The bank instructed us to contact their fraud department directly." Vanessa's smile faltered for the first time all evening, the crystal glass in her hand trembling slightly as the rich red wine inside it caught the light. Before she could respond, a low, distant wail began rising somewhere beyond the property's edge. Faint at first, then rapidly building into a chorus of overlapping sirens, cutting sharply through the warm evening air. I leaned forward in my seat, my breathing slow and completely controlled, watching the first flickers of red and blue light begin painting the manicured hedges along the driveway. Somewhere inside myself, buried beneath 40 years of hard-won composure, a small and very old part of me still ached at the sight of my own son standing at the center of all this ruin. But I had learned a long time ago that grief and resolve could occupy the same chest without one ever weakening the other. The transaction my son had believed was already secured had just collapsed entirely in front of the one man whose respect he had spent the entire evening desperately chasing. And somewhere behind those elegant glass doors, the quiet, patient machine I had built my entire life around had finally fully woken up. The sirens grew louder with each passing second, and through the monitor I watched the party outside dissolve into confused, scattered movement. Guests drifted toward the tall windows, champagne glasses forgotten in their hands, murmuring to one another as the flashing red and blue lights swept across the manicured hedges lining the driveway. I recognized, even from that distance, the particular quality of panic that spreads through a crowd of wealthy people who have never once had to imagine themselves on the wrong side of a police response. Vanessa stood frozen near the staircase, the caterer still hovering awkwardly beside her, when the first patrol cars rolled to a stop at the edge of the property. I watched her face shift through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally something close to genuine fear, as half a dozen federal agents in dark jackets moved swiftly up the front walkway alongside local Seattle police officers. The heavy front door swung open before anyone inside thought to answer it. I do not know precisely what Nathan expected in that moment, watching agents move calmly and methodically through his celebration, but I doubt it was anything close to what actually happened. Through the monitor, I watched the formal dining room doors open from the outside, and two agents stepped through them without hesitation, badges already raised. "Nathan Hale," one of them said, his voice carrying clearly, even through the small speaker in our van. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest, on charges including wire fraud, forgery of legal documents, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse." I watched my son's face on the monitor, pale and slack, with a shock so complete it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. Halverson, standing just a few feet away, took one long step backward, putting visible distance between himself and the collapsing scene, his own lawyers already reaching for their phones. "This is a misunderstanding," Nathan said, his voice climbing half an octave higher than I had ever heard it. "There has been some kind of mistake. I have documentation, full legal authority." The agent did not slow down. "Your medical power of attorney was obtained through fraud and documented poisoning of the grantor," he said flatly. "We have the surveillance footage, the pharmaceutical evidence, and the financial records. You can discuss the documentation with your attorney." I watched them turn my son around and guide his hands gently but firmly behind his back. The metallic click of handcuffs closing was faint through the audio feed, but I heard it clearly enough. It was a sound I had never once imagined I would hear attached to my own child. And for one brief, unguarded moment, something old and tender inside me ached with a grief that had nothing to do with money or betrayal at all. I thought of a small boy on the deck of my first boat, gripping my hand too tightly during his first real storm, and I wondered, uselessly, at what exact point along the way that boy had disappeared entirely into the man standing handcuffed in a stranger's dining room. Out in the foyer, a second team of agents approached Vanessa directly. She had gone very pale, one hand instinctively moving to rest across her rounded belly, as though the gesture alone might somehow shield her from what was coming. All the careful performance she had maintained throughout the evening, the easy laughter, the graceful hostess presence, drained away from her all at once, leaving behind something far smaller and far more frightened than I had ever seen from her before. "Please," she said, her voice suddenly small and pleading in a way I had never once heard from her before. "I am pregnant. Surely there is some other way to handle this." The lead agent's expression did not soften. "Ma'am, we are aware of your condition and appropriate accommodations will be made throughout this process. But you are being detained on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and elder abuse." I watched them lead her out through the same front door she had walked through earlier that evening with such absolute confidence, past a crowd of stunned guests who had come expecting champagne and celebration, and instead found themselves witnessing the complete and public collapse of a fortune built on lies. Halverson slipped away during the chaos, his lawyers already working furiously to distance Nordvik Marine from any appearance of involvement. Though Dale assured me quietly that the documented evidence of his participation in the attempted buyout would not simply vanish because he managed to avoid handcuffs on this particular evening. Men like Halverson rarely faced consequences at the same speed as everyone around them. But even he, I suspected, would spend a considerable amount of money in the coming months, making certain his name stayed as far from a courtroom as possible. I sat very still in the back of that van, watching the flashing lights paint the elegant house in alternating waves of red and blue, listening to the muffled sounds of a party collapsing into chaos and recrimination. I felt none of the savage satisfaction I might have expected after everything they had done to me. What I felt instead was something quieter and considerably more complicated. A strange, hollow ache sitting directly beside the relief. Dale glanced over at me, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "It is done, Thomas," he said quietly. "Whatever happens from here, they cannot touch you anymore." I nodded slowly, watching through the monitor, as officers escorted my son toward a waiting patrol car. His shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat I had never once seen on him, not even as a small boy who had lost a childhood argument he desperately wanted to win. I thought of Anna in that moment, and the promise I had made her about a house full of children and laughter. And I wondered, with a grief too complicated to fully name, what she would have made of the son we raised together, and the terrible distance between the boy she loved and the man who had just been placed in the back of that car. She had always seen the best in Nathan, even when I sometimes struggled to, and I found myself grateful in a strange and painful way that she had not lived long enough to watch this particular night unfold. The performance was finally over. But I understood sitting there in the humid darkness of that surveillance van that the hardest part of this entire ordeal, the part involving forgiveness or the absence of it, had only just begun. Samuel arranged for me to see Nathan 3 days later, in a cold fluorescent interrogation room at the Federal Building downtown. The kind of room designed entirely for confession rather than comfort. I was given exactly 5 minutes, standing across a scarred metal table from the son I had raised with my own 2 hands. Samuel had warned me, quietly and carefully, that I was under no obligation to go, that many men in my position chose never to see their children again after something like this. I went anyway. I have never been a man who could leave a wound unexamined, even one I knew would not heal cleanly. Nathan sat with his wrist chained to a steel ring bolted into the tabletop, his expensive suit replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit that seemed to swallow whatever remained of his former confidence. Vanessa sat beside him, her hands resting protectively over her belly, her eyes red and swollen from what had clearly been days of crying. "Please, Thomas," she said, before I had even fully taken my seat, her voice trembling with something that might have been genuine desperation or one final performance. I could no longer tell the difference. "You still have the power to end this. Please, for the sake of the child, show some mercy and make this go away." I did not answer her directly. I reached instead into my jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope, the same kind I had used for 40 years to hold shipping manifests and insurance claims. I opened it slowly and began laying its contents across the cold metal table between us. First came the photographs of the blister pack, followed by the toxicology report confirming exactly what had been in my system for 2 months. Then the forged notarization on the medical power of attorney. Then the wire transfer records connecting Dr. Prescott's gambling debts to Nathan's Shell Corporation. Each document landed on that table with a soft, final sound, like stones dropped into still water. "You did not simply try to take my money," I said, my voice quiet and even. "You poisoned my food. You tried to have me legally erased so you could steal what I spent 40 years building. And you did it while calling me Dad in a voice you knew was a lie." Nathan stared down at the evidence, his chest rising and falling in short, shallow breaths. "What happens to us now?" he finally asked, his voice hollow and small. I reached into the envelope one final time and withdrew 2 last documents, sliding them across the table until they rested directly beside his chained hands. "These are the bankruptcy filings for Lonewick Maritime Holdings," I said. "And beneath them, the foreclosure notice for the house where your celebration ended 3 nights ago." Neither of them spoke another word. Vanessa buried her face in her trembling hands. I stood turned away from the table and walked out through the heavy steel door without looking back, leaving behind whatever remained of the son I once knew. The following weeks moved with the particular grinding efficiency of federal prosecution. The evidence we had gathered left no room for clever defense strategies or sympathetic juries. Nathan and Vanessa were formally indicted on charges of wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and elder abuse, facing a combined sentence that could run well past 15 years for each of them. The federal prosecutors, once they understood the full scope of what had been done to me, showed no interest whatsoever in a lenient plea deal. And the presiding judge made clear from the earliest hearings that leniency would not be forthcoming from the bench either. Back home in Rockland, I sat with Samuel and finalized the last of the paperwork required to close this chapter of my life completely. I removed Nathan's name from every corporate document, every succession plan, every trust bearing the Hale family name. I signed the papers promoting Danny Reyes, the quiet, steady young man who had run 2 of my smaller vessels faithfully for years, to captain of my entire fleet, effective immediately. Danny had never once asked me for anything beyond a fair wage and an honest word. And I found in the end that loyalty earned through years of honest work meant considerably more to me than loyalty assumed through blood alone. He wept, actually wept, standing in my study when I told him. And I understood in that moment that I had simply been looking for a son in all the wrong places for far too many years. I established a fully protected trust for my unborn grandchild, administered entirely by Samuel, sealed permanently against any access from either parent. Whatever mistakes his mother and father had made, that child would grow up with an education and a future entirely untouched by the poison that had nearly destroyed mine. And I made one final donation, a significant sum directed toward a regional research foundation, studying the very neurological conditions Vanessa had once tried to fake. In me, a small attempt to turn something ugly into something that might eventually help someone else. It seemed a fitting use for money that had nearly been used to bury me alive. I stood on my own dock the following morning, watching the sun break slowly over the water, painting the harbor in soft streaks of gold exactly the way it always had. The Anna Marie was gone, sold away before any of this began. But a new vessel sat in her place, freshly christened, waiting for her first voyage out under Danny's steady hand. I had chosen her name carefully, standing at the shipwright's counter a few weeks earlier, and I felt no hesitation at all in what I wrote on the registration papers. I thought of Anna and the promise I had made her so many years ago, and I understood, standing there in the cold morning air with the whole fleet rocking gently before me, that some promises survive even the deepest betrayal, if a man is willing to keep fighting for them. The grandchild growing inside Vanessa would never know the harbor the way I did. Not directly, not through me. But he would grow up, protected, educated, and free of the poison that had nearly destroyed the family meant to raise him. The empire was safe. The harbor was mine again, fully and completely. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something close to peace settle quietly over the water. There is a lesson in all of this that took me 68 years and one betrayal to fully understand. And I share it now, not out of bitterness, but because I believe someone listening tonight needs to hear it. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and love, however deep, should never mean blindness. We spend our whole lives building something to leave behind for the people we love, but sometimes the hardest and most necessary work is building walls to protect ourselves from the very people we raised. Greed has a way of turning the child you once carried on your shoulders into a stranger who sees you only as an obstacle standing between them and everything you own. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong beneath the surface. Never sign away your independence out of fear or guilt. And always, always pay attention to what happens quietly beneath your own roof. I think of Anna often, especially now, standing on this dock in the early morning light. God knows she deserved a family untouched by this kind of darkness. And God knows I wish I could have spared her the truth of what our son became. But I believe with everything left in this old heart that God does not measure a life by the wounds it survives, but by what a man chooses to build again once the storm has finally passed. If this story found its way into your evening, and it touched something honest in you, I would be grateful if you would let me know. Tell me in the comments if you have ever had to protect yourself from someone who was supposed to love you. And if you believe stories like this one matter, stay close to this channel. There are more waiting to be told, and I intend to keep telling them for as long as I still have breath and a harbor to come home to.